We are going. We got it. Good work, everybody. Okay. First off, want to thank everyone for being here. Crossing the T's, TSRs, timing sheets, PCS, all kind of that type of stuff. We're going to dig into it today, and we're going to make sure you all know what's going on with everything and some of the things we're thinking about. But before we get into that, we want to do a little bit of, like I said, housekeeping things. Coming up, we have an April luncheon. This is on April 20th. Charlotte from PACE will be giving a presentation. This is out in Schaumburg. I'm sure you've all seen this email come in. I think we already had 20 people register. So if you're interested, make sure you get in there and get signed up. Also, some updates from within the section. I don't see any planners here, but that doesn't mean you can't be here because we are allowing planners in here for free. I'm sure everyone's seen this from, it's an initiative from ITE. For the year 2023, if you're a planner, you can join ITE for free. Then the next year will be 50% off. We're trying to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible. Transportation isn't just trying to reflect that as well. You can see all this stuff. This has all been sent to you, but just a reminder, if you know any planners, let them know. We're open to them. Speaking of that, we want to thank all of our sponsors that have been on here, a good amount. So we appreciate that. We appreciate making sure that the Illinois is able to do the things that we like to do and are able to do. So much appreciated for that. I know y'all came here just to see me, so I'm not even gonna bother talking about this. What are you gonna get out of this thing? We want to teach you as much as we can about TSRs and timing sheets and what goes into them as possible. And that's kind of just a general idea of what this presentation is even about. So let's get down to brass tacks. We have a TCR or a TSR, a TCS, and a TS. A lot of T's. What do these things even mean? If raise your hand if you've ever worked on either a TSR, a TCS, or a TS plan. Right, I'm sure most people have here. If you haven't, this is your first time ever seeing it. Great, we'll see if this helps get you there or not. We're going to dig into what each one of these things is. I've got this set up in such a way that we'll talk a little bit about the process. We'll talk a little bit about what each of these things are, and then we'll dig into our QA/QC document. And if we got any extra time, we have questions people want to ask, why we do this, what's up with that. We've also got a couple template TSRs and timing sheets that are a good representation of some of the weird things that we like to work with, or some just a good example of something. So first things first, TSR, traffic signal requirement. This is essentially our traffic signal design file. It tells us everything about lane spots. It tells us everything about how signal heads look, phasing, volumes, APS, all that type of thing. If it's related to traffic operations, as the design side of that, it's usually in here. Moving on, we talked about TCS. That is essentially our conduit plan. It stands for traffic control signals. I didn't say that up on top because it's kind of more than that, right? It's a unique idea that engineering builds this whole thing, and it's looking at what foundations are needed. It's looking at the conduit types that are needed. It's looking at cables. It's looking at all of the hard engineering type side of things like that. So we will not go into that as much today. Those are in another realm of CDOT. Maybe we'll do another one of those later someday, but we're not going to do that today. What we will talk about is the TS, timing, schedule, plan. What is the signal timing that we put into the controller? That's what these sheets dictate. On the left side, you can see we have a NEMA plan, that the Cadillac of what timing sheets are, and there's a lot of adaptability with these. So every time we're putting in a new signal, we're using NEMA. On the right side is an interval. Before I came here, I'd never seen an interval sheet before. It does exactly what you tell it to do, right? So the thought is that there's not a standard, there's not a conflict monitor necessarily, but you're essentially each one of those the grids and the filled in blanks and the table on the bottom there, that's essentially telling what is running with what. You're looking at every single signal head. You're deciding, hey, this is R3 or maybe the green 3 or whatever thing is designated as, and that tells you what it's doing at that certain interval. We still have intervals, but as we're going through, we are updating all interval sheets to be into NEMA. It's just there's a controller update that's needed. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So we're moving to the spot where NEMA is the new standard. We still have a few. Shouldn't say we have a few. We have 3,000 signals. We have a good amount, probably half are in interval. So we're getting there. The other thing to know about NEMA is that when you look at these sheets, I've only given you 2 sheets today. We've got other sheets, but they're not as well fleshed out with everything. We're working on an interval timing sheet. It's just there's a lot of kinks we want to get figured out. Most people use TSRs and the NEMA timing sheet, so that's why the sheet that you have is a NEMA timing sheet. But we are looking at what goes into other plans and how to update this stuff. You know, we have a temp TSR as another note, but we won't be covering that either. So something to be thinking about when we're looking at this stuff. Okay, so what does this stuff even mean? Where are we even at in the process, right? All these letters mean something, right? We don't just do this stuff for fun. Here's the process of what it looks like, right? So what happens is traffic safety receives a TSR, the traffic signal requirement, and that tells us everything where the design is. We'll review it, give comment on it, and we'll approve it once it's set and meets CDOT standard and compliance of CDOT rules, essentially. Once that is set, the TCS plan can get made. So we'll send this to engineering. Will not start a TSR unless, or they will not start a TCS plan unless the TSR is already approved and made. The reason being is that, you know, things can change. You can move poles here and there. They don't want to even start until it's fully fleshed out and approved. So a lot of the TCS stuff, some of that has to do with utilities, you know, EFP, or all those, getting the permits and utilities and water and everything that's underground is essentially reflected in the TCS. So the standard procedure is that TCS doesn't get started until TSR is done. There's a few situations where we're allowing that to happen because of expedited things. So if you're working on a project where we're not done doing the TSR yet, that's because of that. We're experimenting a little bit with doing the TCS and the TSR in parallel, and then anytime there's a conflict, we update the TSR, put out a revision, that type of thing. So TCS, that gets approved by engineering. They do their review of it, and then they submit it to, I mean, it gets back to the consultant, but when we're doing that, the TCS plan can be built as well. So you can clearly tell that the TCS, the TSR, and TS stuff gets very confusing, because that's going to be about the 3rd time that I'll do that for this presentation here today. But the TS, the timing sheet plan, that is a kind of a final check. That's looking at everything in the TSR and the TCS, and it's just making sure that, you know, all the things that we're saying in the TS plan match with the TCS. The TCS needs to be approved before we can approve the timing sheet. So you see that yellow line on the side, that's essentially kind of a cheat parallel type way. So I don't want people to think that, you know, we have to wait for a TSR to be done, then we can start our TCS. Then once the TCS is done, now we can start the TS, the timing sheet. Once that TSR is done, you can work on the timing sheet. You can work on any of the signal operations, any of that type of stuff in parallel while that TCS plan is going. It's just the approval is dependent on the TCS plan. So in an effort to be more efficient with how things are done, if you're getting your TSRs all approved, you can still do that on the side, especially because there's a lot of work that goes into a timing sheet, you know, looking at synchro, looking at volumes, crosswalk calcs, system-wide issues, all that type of stuff is looked at and is a part of your timing sheet. So there's one more bit in the front of this, and it has to do with the TSR. At Traffic Safety, we look at everything that touches the signals, right? But we work closely with our Complete Streets group. If we notice that there's any bicycle infrastructure, anything like that, before we start our review, we pass that to the Complete Streets group, the esteemed group back here. They do a quick review on it because we want to make sure that everything that our TSR shows has what they want. So we won't even start it until they give comment on it. Just one of those ways we can try to avoid back and forth and kind of these feedback loops of things getting going back and forth on comment. So trying to be proactive with making sure that everything is getting done and everything is getting included for this type of work. Once the TS is all done, construction starts, timing entry, sends a DEO. DEO, that stands for the Department of Electrical Operations, just like the Traffic Safety or the Complete Streets Group or Engineering. They have their own group essentially devoted to streetlights, signals, all that type of stuff. They enter in the timing that is in the timing sheet. So I think we're going to ask, we'll go through and do questions at the end here. I think we're going to have a good amount of time, but if there's anything where it's like, okay, I'm so lost here. Can somebody, raise your hand if you've got a spot where you don't think you can wait till the end of this whole thing to ask it, because, there might be a few things where you can note it down, but as long as we're here, this can be a conversation and not just me talking at you type thing. So, all right. So that's the idea behind the process. How do we make our lives easier? How do we make my lives easier? How do we make your lives easier? Anything like that. So what we did is we built a QA document looking at everything that we think about when looking at timing sheets, when looking at TSRs, any of these type of things that we check. How can we keep tabs on what needs to go into this sheet just as a guideline, right? I think I should add a clarifying point here too. Up in the corner, it says draft in big bold letters, big red bold letters. That will probably not ever change. This will be a living document, right? This, the city is adapting. We're learning new things. We're trying new things. We don't want to have anybody say that, oh, well, we did exactly what you said and it should be good. We don't have to think about it, right? We don't want that to be the case. This is going to be a living thing. And we will figure out some way to get it posted online or sent out. We'll figure that out when the time comes. The point is, this is a draft. So yeah, that's the one thing to think about this. The other thing to think about is, as consultants, you're putting your name on these things that are getting built, right? So, we're putting at CDOT, we're putting our names on that, but we're also asking consultants to put their name on it too. We need to make sure that QA/QC is happening because not only is it going to make your lives easier for deadlines, for getting things, back and forth of comments. It's just the more comments you have, the more round of iterative comments you have going back and forth, the worse it's going to be, right? So please make sure that as a consultant, or if you're an entry-level engineer or professional, or if you're maybe the person approving or reviewing some of this stuff, we really need to make sure that these are getting looked at. We have a few people, out of all these, we have a few consultants where we are fully confident in what they do. We'll still check it, but there's a few where it's like, oh yeah, we're excited to see the work that they give. Sometimes we do not have that, right? And we know who those people are. I'm not going to tell you who they are because I want you to think about it and I want you to stew over it, right? But the idea is there might be situations where when we get documents from someone, oh no, this is so-and-so, buckle in, this might be a lot, right? So make yourself look good and make us look good as well, because we're going to get things more done more efficiently. I think that was the QA points that I had out of that. Yeah, let's dig in. Okay, TSRs. We're going to go through this whole QA/QC document. You don't need to go through every single step of these because there's a lot of kind of gimmies. There's a lot of simple common sense type things. A lot of them are right from the MUTCD. There's very few of these that are CDOT specific. A lot of them are, this is the law, know the law, right? So like I said, there's a few that are like that. We're going to go through each of these topics. We've kind of color coded this out so that you can kind of see, I think graphically, and I think a lot of other people do too. So when you're thinking about this, it's good to kind of lump these into certain realms. So while we're not going to go through every single line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the spots that I think might be an issue, or that might have, historically been an issue, or maybe they're not clear. What are the things that people need to know that we run into, right? You know, putting a correct border, people understand what a border is, right? Putting north up, right? We don't need to talk and, you know, figure out that north needs to go up, but we will go through some of these more goofy ones. So starting off, ADA, signage, pavement marking plans. This is kind of not a huge crazy thought that we want to review every part of these plans. But that's kind of the big point with this, is that traffic safety reviews signals and traffic signals and that type of thing that go with it. However, we're usually the last people to look at some of this stuff, right? We're usually the last people we're the people that are out in the field that are seeing this thing turn on. So we want to make sure that every single step that we can do is funneling all these other steps that have happened up above, right? So ADA, traffic safety does not review ADA plans, right? We don't approve ADA or detours or signage, anything like that, but we do like to make sure that it's what it should be. If we see something wrong, we'll say it, right? But it's not a type of thing that we'll go out and we'll approve. Another thing is partial TSRs. We talk about what a temp TSR and a full TSR. A partial TSR is essentially when there's not full modernization occurring. So things like, you know, new curb, APS. You know, if you're doing work where you're just putting in left turns at a mast arm, on an existing mast arm, that'd be a partial TSR. The thing with partial TSRs, though, is there's a lot going on a plan. And for clarity's sake, for your end, for our end, for the people that are building the work later on, it's good to show what is actually occurring with this work. So things like, oh, we'll be removing this mast arm pole and moving it to this other side of the pole, or, you know, the one corner is getting new ramps or something like that. That type of thought. And then the next one is very nitpicky, but it drives me absolutely nuts. Clipping your symbols. What does that mean? I want things to be opaque because we have a lot of tight intersections. We have a lot of stuff going on in an intersection. I'm not going to lose my mind trying to mark up on red with my awful handwriting some of this stuff that it has things where you can see through it. So, for example, on the left side here, we have the 20-foot mast arm. You can see we have those signal heads. We have on the bottom corner, we have a signal head. You can see through all that, right? And in this case, it might not be that bad, but when it gets to be a smaller intersection, there's a lot going on. It's just a nightmare to deal with, and it's a nightmare to understand what's going on. So major symbols, your detail symbol, your mast arm symbols, your poles, your pedestrian signal heads, your signal heads themselves, a few other things like that. We like to make sure that those things are opaque because it just makes it much more better to view, and honestly makes it look better. Not that these need to be, you know, I'm not going to frame these up and look at them or put them on my fridge or anything, but you still want it to look as good as it can to avoid confusion. That's it for the housekeeping stuff. We're going to dig into phasing and traffic operations next. And the two things we're going to talk about, because a lot of these are pretty standard, you know, adding volumes, sequences, that type of thing, is LPIs. LPI stands for leading pedestrian interval. If you don't know what that is, that's essentially the thought where you're holding the signal, the green signal, for 3 to 4 seconds to give pedestrians time to get into that intersection. So it's a safety measure that we use. It also makes things, you know, thinking about the public realm, it makes things easy to operate as a pedestrian. I'm sure if y'all came in here, you've seen the many LPIs we have around here. But LPIs are weird in the controller, right? So what that means is the way that an LPI thinks, or that the controller thinks about an LPI, is that you're holding the chord phase for that LPI amount. And maybe this is a point that isn't needed to get into yet if people don't understand the point of what the differences are. Maybe it's something we don't need to talk about at this point right now. But the idea is that when you're looking at your sequencing diagram, you have lettered phases for each phase, right? So, you know, while we think about a NEMA phase as a true phase, when you're looking at this TSR, we like to group these up by phase. in addition to the phase. So this is a confusing thing that I would like to change, and maybe it'll change someday, but for right now, this is what we're going to deal with. But if you look at your Cottage Grove and Rhodes, on the back side, we have a sequencing diagram. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lettered phases. What that is it's a phase for every time something is occurring, right? So while normally we would say the A phase, that's our chord phase, that's the what the signal comes back to, what 0 is, what extra time gets. When you put in LPI there, the controller thinks that the LPI is your first part of the phase. In interval controllers, you can decide what you want the beginning phase to be. In NEMA, this is just how NEMA thinks, right? It's like, the alphabet. Why does it have 26 letters? It does. That's just what it does, right? So that's kind of one of the constraints that we're working with. If you have an LPI on the chord phase, that will be the actual start of the reference point and not B. That make any sense? Any questions on that? Okay, cool. All right, well, digging deeper into that, we talked about how each of these phases represent something that is happening at a signal. This is something I'd really like to change, but we'll get there. But where we're at right now, it doesn't hurt anything, and I'd rather make sure that everybody knows what these need to do before uprooting the system on how these want to go. But if you look in your TSR that we provided, these are actually E, F, and G. These are on that sheet. So E, F, and G, those are not in order, right? Those are not in sequence. The idea here is that you're showing each operation of what those 3 things could happen. So, if you would have E if you only have an eastbound left actuation. You would have F if you would have an eastbound left, westbound left actuation, and you would have G if you only have a westbound left actuation. You could say that why not make all of these E1, E2, E3? That's the way that these are for now. When we need to work down the line, maybe we'll update that. But when looking at these, that's how you read these. So if you look at the bottom, because the thing that I think about when I started is, how do we even know what's going on here then, right? Do you have to already know what's happening? What you do is you look in the bottom left of each of those phase sequences, and it'll tell you eastbound left action, essentially the condition, right? This is a logic type condition. So that's how you can kind of tell when something is on or not on this sequencing diagram. Those are the big points for the phasing and operations one. So I'm going to jump into the next one, which is a lot of what we dig into when we're looking at these TSRs is, where do we put these signal heads, right? Because we want to make sure that these are exactly what we say they are. We do a heavy amount of review on this. As many of you may know, we want to make sure that things are as good as they could possibly be, right? We have a very litigious constituent, so we want to make sure that these are following everything down to a T, and that there's no chances of error or anything causing any mishaps. So that's what this is about. From the MUTCD though, no less than 8 feet. That's not a wild number. I'm sure many of you all know that, but we have differences of when we use this and when we use different numbers. But the first thing you're going to think of is, okay, well, all right, what's going on here then? We have 6 feet between these between signals at times. Those are for different movements, right? This is a unique intersection. If all of these were on the same movement, they would need to be legally separated by 8 feet, because this is the this is a 5-legged intersection. We have one movement that's not coming up with another movement. The asterisk is referring to a programmable message or programmable signal head, which essentially shows that you will not view it from a certain angle. So that's kind of why we do that. Most cases, you're not going to have to think about that, but you will need to think about when you don't have 8 feet. I'm going to go back a couple because there's a good example here that we had just showed, right? This was 12 feet. We modified it to 9 feet. 7 feet because that's not legal, right? So something to be thinking about with that. Why'd we modify that from 12 to 9 feet though? So this is almost the exact situation of that. It's a little different location, but the way that we orient signal heads is that inside arm, that inside signal head on the mast arm, we like to have 2 to 3 feet from the curb or from any bike parking infrastructure, anything like that. The reason being is that if you see a signal head, there should be no shadow of a doubt that if you were to drive straight underneath that you're not going to smash into a curb or you're not going to smash into a parked car or anything like that. Just another redundancy that we like to have. So when you're looking at putting in signal heads, the inside signal head, that's kind of how we think about that and where that one goes. What about the outside signal head? Similar thought, if it's protected permissive, we like to have these on the, if it's permissive, we like to have them as close to the line as possible, the center line, while not crossing over with the opposing. So one of the notes here is that we like to have 2 feet of separation with that. If it's a 5-section head, we like to have it as close to that through lane, that through left lane line as possible. So that's what the picture on the right is referring to. Those handy dandy done in paint lines that I had finished yesterday when I was making this presentation are denoting that is exactly where it should be to show that this is where that signal head should go for ideal viewing. If you can't get that on the, let's say you can't get it on the line, we'd rather have that in the through lane than we would in the left lane, right? Because the left lane, we want to treat that as essentially only where you're viewing it, whereas in this situation, that left is also serving as a primary signal head. So that's just what it is. We can dig into that on why we do that with primaries and that type of stuff. We'll get there if people have questions on it, but for now we're not gonna. 3-section protected lefts, similar thought. You're gonna have to just trust me that those two are in line, but I had to break them because the intersection was too big. So whenever we have a 3-section, that needs to be in that left turn lane, centered if possible. Yeah, that's the thought behind that. So far, none of this stuff is real rocket sciencey, right? Which is good. We want that. But the big point is that we want to get these on paper so that you all are able to check against that. At some point we're getting to the point of thinking, oh, well, 2 + 2 is this because it is, right? So we're going to get into some more interesting stuff later here, I promise.
I have a question for you, Tyler.
Yes.
So left turn lane, 3-section head shall be aligned with the left turn lane. If we're shifting a left turn lane, what is your cutoff for needing to then shift the 3-section head? So if it's aligned with the edge of the lane line, is that acceptable? Or do we need to shift it? If it's a foot off the lane line, is that a definite, we need to shift it if we're shifting a left turn lane? For example, to accommodate protected bike lanes.
Right. I think I need to actually understand what you're asking. You're saying, would you rather, if you have a protected left,
yes,
you would rather have, ask your question one more time.
If you needed to shift an existing left turn lane,
right,
at an intersection that has a 3-section head with a dedicated left.
Yep.
Just for that left turn lane. What is the cutoff for, okay, all right, we're shifting this left turn lane 5 feet, and now that signal head is no longer aligned with the center of the left turn lane. It's now 5 feet to the right. It's like the edge of the left turn line. Sure. At what point is that like too much of a shift where you say, okay, now we need to extend the mast arm, we need to shift the
case by case? And honestly, that's going to be a lot of some of these questions, or will be case by case. Thinking it without knowing a situation, what it actually would be right now, I would say you would have to move that signal head to make it work. You have to make it work and be visible. But if it's on the verge, we might even decide that even if it is in that left lane barely, tough, we want it moved over. So there's a lot of wiggle on these. These are, again, guidelines. Judgment and following the MUTCD are ultimately a lot of these deciding factors. So good question.
Sorry to derail.
That's okay. Geometry. So a lot of times traffic safety doesn't necessarily have much of a say in geometry. Right? By the time we're getting this stuff, it might be 60% plans, it might be 90% plans even. Things might not be able to shift that much because of utilities and ADA, whatever. So what we still like to view is a couple of these major points for geometry. So the first one is that we should have at least 20 feet of traveled way. What does that mean? If you look at the bottom of this intersection right here, we have bump outs. I love bump outs. I think they're great. I think that we can all agree that they're making things safer. But as a result, we want to modify some of the things that we do here. We want to make sure that that traveled way is not less than 20. We have found that if it's shorter, people will they'll drive on the curb regardless of what the curb says. So we want to still give ample room for turning, for semis, that type of thing. And 20 is about the number that we came to. So this is just a one-way. We would not make an 8-foot bumped out lane. We try to have a minimum of 20 feet if needed for things if we're going to use that. Another thing on this is that you can see the north end and the south end. If you were to draw a line between those curbs, they do not line up. This is one that we made a comment to update that, and it's getting updated. This is a similar thought with the signal heads. You could make an argument that, well, just because the signal head is right there doesn't mean that someone's going to drive right underneath that. You could make that argument, and I don't disagree. But just for the sake of redundancy and safety, we want to make sure that if someone were to be following the curb, that they would not bump into another curb. So in this situation, the one on the left, this is a one-way going to the north. The curb on the left isn't as big of an issue. We don't care if there's room on the other side, but if the opposing curb is impeding, we would like to, maybe the bottom bump out has to move over to the left a little bit, or something, or maybe there's a bump out modification that can occur or something like that. So things we like to think about, still good to have as a redundancy factor. So those are some of the points on geometry. APS, we are doing a lot of work putting in APS push buttons. The reason we're doing that is that every new signal is getting, if it's a true TSR, it's getting new curb, it's getting new ADA ramps, it's getting a new controller, it's getting a new cabinet possibly, it's getting all this other stuff in addition to APS units. So the reason we're doing APS units, regardless of if they're actuated or not, a lot of these signals are on PED recall, is that we're looking to improve the experience for users that might not be visually impaired or hard of hearing or anything like that. So there's a lot of thought that goes into where these APS units go, just because we want to make sure that we're giving the best product. So from ADA and from CDOT ADA, we have 1.56% is considered our level landing. ADA is a little higher. I think it's 2.3-ish. But what we consider in CDOT level is that 1 to 64. So if you have a push button, that must be on a level landing to be considered adequate for CDOT compliance. A lot of that reasoning is because if you're in a wheelchair and you're stopping to push that button, you want to make sure that you're resting and that they're not going to roll into the intersection. You want to make sure that they're staying safe in that spot. So that's one of the things we think about with APS locations. Another thing to think about is how far you are from the ramp. 6 feet, we really allow 10, but 6 is really what we want. Less than 6 is that perfect spot. The perfect location of an APS unit would be in the corner flare of the ramp, because that is a perfect spot where you can push that, and then you don't have to maneuver yourself around this ramp. They can go straight into that ADA ramp. And then the other thing we like to think about is the distances between these APS units. So in the left, you can see we have a number there, 2.5 feet. That is the distance from one push button to the other. This is from MUTCD, and ADA. This is saying that if that distance is less than 10 feet, a speech walk message is required at CDOT. So in that other situation, we had went back one or two. This is that same location. If you look on the right, those are on the same pole. Those need to have a speech walk. The reason being is that you want to make sure that you know where those are, but they're also not necessarily feeding each other because they use the microphones. You don't want to always have them on. You want to make sure that they know which one is referring to which movement. The one on the bottom is the salt shed. If anyone hasn't been there yet, it's a cool spot, but I also want to think about when you're over there, think about all the, that's a Magnolia Blackhawk. We did a lot of work on that intersection. This is the one that we have the unique situation here. There's a lot that happened here, and there's a lot that is going on here. So if you're catching a show there, check it out. It's always, people love that when you're going where you got your friends and you're showing your significant other traffic signal stuff. So you can wow your friends with your amazing knowledge. What else? APS units. So this is my handy dandy. I just drew this. This isn't a document. This is not this is not from ADA or anything. This is just done by me. So what this is essentially, the idea here is that if you have a push button in the parkway or on a ledge or anything like that, you might need to put an extension there. So if you were a person, the idea behind an extension is that if you're sitting at that intersection, you need to be able to access it safely. It should be flush with that intersection. 10 inches is the smallest extender that we can get. So if it's smaller than 10, that's also allowed within ADA requirements and CDOT compliance on that. So that's allowed. But if it's more than 10 inches, that will need an extender. This location actually did use that. It wasn't necessarily right there, but that distance needed an extension because it was just too far to get pushed. It was just far enough out of the way. So when you're doing these TSRs, it's really important to make sure that you have, we're doing a lot of new developments that are happening. You want to make sure that if you have maybe not necessarily parkway, but possibly a concrete where it's dropping a curb, you've got a ramp that's going down, that needs to be as flush as possible with where that accessible path is. And if not, it'll need an extension to make that. Another point here, another award-winning Da Vinci style type drawing from yours truly. This is where we kind of the bounds of where we are allowed to put signal heads, right? Because you want a person to be able to see where they're going. These are not, again, not crazy out there thoughts. We're just putting kind of a number and putting that into our standards. In this situation, I think we had about 5 feet from the ramp to where the pole would be. I don't think this is a real location. This is just one I found that had a lot of sidewalk. 5 feet is, if you look in the MUTCD, there's some clause where it allows you to have a certain distance of viewing within 10 feet or wherever point from the crosswalk. 5 feet is around the spot where it's unreasonable to expect a pedestrian to see that the whole way. On a similar thought, although you may be able to see it, we don't like to have the ped head farther than 15 feet from behind the ramp. While you may see it, it's just better to have it closer for ideal pedestrian use. And Kurt, yeah, go for it.
All these dimensions you're talking about are to center of pole, right?
Yes.
Or face of curve?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then do you have any guidance on when you can't put the signal pole right next to the crosswalk and you need an APS? Any guidance on trying to move the signal pole versus putting a separate push button only post to just kind of whatever works?
Case by case. If you can move the pole and put it on, great. But if you can, you want to obviously minimize. It's one of those where you don't really have. You've got multi-factors that you're trying to optimize for, right? So while you still want to save money and save on things that might get hit or save maintenance, you also want things to be as ideal as possible for all users. So no hard and fast answer for that one, unfortunately. A lot of case by case stuff. This is I would say APS units and signal poles and signal heads, that is where most subjective things are. You guys have all worked on TSRs. That is definitely the biggest wiggle room. And we might even decide something, put it on paper, realize, it looked good, but now that we see it, it doesn't. So there might be some back and forth on that. The closest we can get to that spot, the least we can do to minimize those type of back and forth. So great question. Anything else while we're talking on that? We're making great time. So,
yep. I have a question about LPIs.
Sure.
When should we include that?
Ooh, good question. On here I have this on both of them because this comes up a good amount. It comes up so much that we might have on the TSR, we decide to, and then when we do the actual timing sheet, we rethink it because it would imply some other lead lag. If there's an arrow and other things would happen. Very fluffy, but a lot of it comes down to if you're by a school, what's your land use? You have a park, a church, school, that type of thing nearby. Head numbers is a great indicator. T intersections, we do a lot of T intersections of the one way because there's only one way for drivers to go, right? So they might not be thinking about finding a gap or anything, right? So that's one of the spots we'll use that too. But those are all, again, pretty subjective. So good question. And Kurt is gone, but you could probably talk more about this stuff too. When we're doing our review, obviously we have the bike group review all these, but we like to, we have some things on here that we think about with bikes as well. The first one being, I already said that. Make sure that Kurt and Gina and the Complete Streets group are looking at all these plans. They are the masters of this domain, and we want to make sure that the things they want are getting incorporated into that. The other one, this is maybe news to some people, but if you're doing any work with bike phases, you already know this. If you're doing a bike phase, you can't have any conflicting movements with that, right? So, we talk about why we have so many protected movement or protected arrows with a right turn. For example, this is by City Hall here, because legally that is what the MUTCD interim approval requires. In many situations, it makes a lot of sense. In some situations, you need to be careful because it might not, we've had this situation come up with contraflow bike lanes where we're putting in a one-way, we're converting it into a contraflow for the bike lane, but only allowing vehicles one way. So we put a bike phase there because we don't necessarily want to have a green ball because we don't want to necessarily show that vehicles can take that. But now you have a conflict with your green ball opposing and the bike phase. So again, you could make the argument that, well, that's not what the intent of this, that's not what they meant. That's not our thought. That's what the law says. So we're going to follow that, and we're going to make sure that we're following it to that letter. The other big thing that comes up is making sure they're using bike crossing blocks. We're in a spot where the standard, I don't know when, Gina might have a number on when the standard bike markings detail was made, but it was somewhat recent. So we're seeing a lot of plans that we're using the old one where it was just the hatchings across the intersection. Nowadays we are doing those green MMA blocks. And then this is right by my house. I look at this bike box every day and I bike it when I decide to bike in. If you're having a green bike box, we need to make sure there's no turn on red all day. That's just one of the things that we want to make sure we're being careful with when we're looking at that. Also, if there's a bike phase, there needs to be a stop bar for it. So, well, not a lot of out there thoughts, right? These are all making sense. There's a lot of common sense. So if there are any questions with that though, please, this is a discussion. This doesn't need to be me talking the whole time. TCS guidelines, tough. Sorry, we're not talking about that today. We are talking about timing sheets though. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip our QR document, QC document. I should be careful mixing up my quality abbreviations here. But looking at this first one, there's two really, really big ones. And the first big one is housekeeping. So when we get timing sheets, a lot of work goes into a timing sheet. You need to have your synchros made. You need to have your crosswalk calculations all made up. All that stuff needs to be made so that you can put the final product onto this, right? So essentially, this is one of the last parts of your design, right? What are you telling the operations to do? So we have a crosswalk calculation sheet. I'm sure many of you seen this. I'm sure not many of you have seen our brand spanking new one right here, where we have added in the automatic, this has no date in it, so that's why there's a -3 for the flashing don't walks. But the idea here is that you're adding in the distance to the push button to the curb. That is a MUTCD 3 feet per second check. It assumes 6 feet if there's nothing, if there's no push button there. And then the last column is just showing the required walk time needed. So what happens is with that 3 feet per second check, you'll need to add any time that is needed, needs to go to the walk. The walk is dependent on the split a lot of times. So this is just a thing to check to say that, oh, my required walk time is actually 8 seconds. I try to get it down to a 65-second cycle and I have 7. You got to modify that to be 8. So we're getting through that. And actually, we just had that happen on one of our jobs. Yeah, on one of they're doing an APS pilot. We modified this because of that. It was always a check that we did, but now it's just good to have it there, right? It's good to have everything just in one spot to see what's happening with it. What we don't want to have happen, and what I don't think is going to happen, is by making these type of templates to have people not think about what these things mean, because it's important to know why these things are like that. You know, we don't want to make a bunch of robots, but we do want to make our lives easier. So we still want people to understand what's going on this. And if you see on the bottom, you can't see it here, but when you see the electronic copy, we've got a kind of that, you know, you can do the borders of what people look at on these sheets. We have a repaste column because if you're flashing no walk time, we have an idea of what a standard is for what we like to use for if you're, you know, if your crosswalks are a little bit different, you'll probably round up to the nearest. If there's 3 seconds different, you'll round up and just get the other one, the bigger of the values. But sometimes we don't do that. So this allows you to enter in the data that you want to use while also repasting in the equation for future use. I don't expect everybody to remember exactly the equation that we had, but if you did overwrite that, you can just paste that into where it needs to go. Yeah, so that's that. I'm going to go back a slide here. You know what? I will go here because we're talking about this. We'll dig a little bit deeper here. Most people have probably already seen this. Most people know this. Just for the sake of redundancy, these X's, those are referring to curb-to-curb distance on the for the crosswalks. The stop bar distance is the all red is calculated by stop bar to stop bar distance, unless it isn't, right? So another one of those case by case type situations. You know, if we have a protected left, that's a big intersection, or if we have a T or something, or just a movement that doesn't occur, that pull the primary movement meeting to the left or the right or something, we will use the actual distance that a vehicle would travel for that number. Yeah, PED speed is usually assumed to be 3.5 unless there's a school or an expectation that it's 3 feet per second. Or no, excuse me, it's usually 3. I'm sorry, I'm getting myself mixed up with our 3s here. 3.5 is usually the number we use. We'll use different numbers if we need to based on land use. I guess is the big major point out of that. I'm not going to even bother digging into that right now. You guys all know what I'm talking about. The other one that we're running into a lot is synchro files, right? We have 3 dials almost always that are being proposed. AM, PM, and the AOT. Sometimes 4 dials if we decide maybe a Saturday plan. We're using a lot more overnight plans where, you know, we're trying to get that cycle low and we're still able to get things operating snappy so that somebody doesn't need to wait to, you know, 3 in the morning. They don't need to wait for nobody. Because a lot of these use PED recall at our signals. The point here is that if you have a dial, we need a synchro for that dial. Now, I know the issue with that is usually comes down to scope. It comes down to, well, we did a study here and we only needed to do the AM and the PM. I get it, but we're proposing 3 plans, right? So if you don't do it, we have to do it, right? Because we're gonna do this regardless. Or we need a 3rd plan regardless of whether or not your AM peak or PM peak, or your scope calls for 2 plans or the 3. So we want to have those. Now, what I don't want that to mean is, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to collect data for the midday, or we need to collect Saturday data or anything like that. I don't have any input on what your project scope is, but we can make assumptions on certain things that we see as if we don't have that data. So sometimes we'll make the case where, we'll pull IDOT data and see that, from this profile of this day, midday is maybe 65% of the AM peak. Great. Then just apply 65% to the volume that you do have, right? It doesn't need to be an exact science, and we're doing a lot of estimating. If anything, we'd rather be conservative, right? But we want to make sure that that number is still getting analyzed, because a lot of times that 3rd dial, that AOT dial, is a lower cycle. We had one happen the other day where somebody had proposed 3 dials, they were all a certain cycle, but then they didn't realize that the AOT had a overnight 65-second cycle. So because they didn't do that analysis and because they didn't look at the existing conditions of what it was, they proposed a higher cycle than was actually existing. So if we were to build that, we'd make things more inefficient for the people that are using that system. So be sure to be thinking about that. If you don't have any data, you can maybe make the claim that it's 85% of the AM peak or something, right? As long as you're putting out a claim and have some justification of that, that's kind of what we want. We don't need the AOT plan to be exact, but we do want it to know what it should be.
AM peak or PM peak?
It depends. It's all again, it's case by case. So really good point. What historically has been done at CDOT, and I think that's how we've got in this situation, right? Is that the AOT plan would just get made from the AM peak, right? That might not be the case. All that stuff is very case by case. And I think I want to be clear with that there's a lot that it could be. What is it? As long most of the times it doesn't really matter. The bigger point is that we have a synchro file to do that and to just make that comparison, because we're going to do it whether you do or not. So if you want to make your lives easier, it's just applying a factor. We'll do the same anyways. Go for it.
So I would say 90% of our timing schedules, they use the same timing plan for all times.
Yep.
I was told that, you guys want all 3 dials showing.
Correct.
Is the AOT synchro file then still required if it's still showing the same timing plan as all the other ones?
Good question. Still yes, because we still want to, it's not as important, but it's still that same idea. Even if it is the same thing, we want to just have a file to prove that that's like that. Maybe we do decide that maybe that's a deciding factor of, maybe we should just drop down, right? So if it's in a spot where it can't change, that might be more fine. But again, that's subjective, because we're probably going to be doing, again, we'll probably make a guess at it if you don't, right? So
I'm just asking.
no, great question. Good question. And you have a really good point on something else too that maybe we'll touch on here a little bit, is that even if we do have the same thing 3 times in a day or 4 times in a day, we still want to have a separate dial for each of those things. The reason being is that you're adding future adaptability into your system. If we go through and we decide, a school got built. We didn't know a school was going to get built, but a school got built in a year. Nobody knew about it. Now there's a major PM rush. DEO doesn't need to go and redo all their stuff. They can just make that one plan operate better. So it's kind of, NEMA allows for it easily. So whether or not you have 3 of the same plan, we still want to show 3 separate plans. Good segue into that. On a similar note, you know, just like talking about the lower plans, we like to have outside signals incorporated into these. Scope issues, maybe you're not able to do that. We're going to do it. It's one of those things we're going to do it anyways, right? You know, if we have a signal that just has one location in time, we know that those don't operate in a vacuum. If those work with a signal in coordination nearby, we're going to put that in there and make them work together as best as we can, right? Because it's an easy update to make. Now, if you truly have, you know, you're out in no man's land and you're surrounded by stop signs, then I get that point. You might not need it, but we'll be doing it anyways, probably. Yep.
What is nearby?
Ooh, does really depend. I probably trend more than we should recommend, just because I'm a believer that even if it's making one person platoon, it's making somebody platoon, right? So it's making it better without people knowing it's making it better. 1,300 feet is probably close to where, if it's a single lane, you know, there's one situation I'm thinking of right now on Northwest Highway. It's in between a triangle location and another big signal location. I'll probably operate that. I'd like to probably operate that on the peaks because it's single lane. There's not a whole, I mean, there's somewhat volume, but it's not like it's a major commuter throughway. And then in the off peaks, I'll have that different cycle. But if I can make them work together and not be a huge detriment to operations, I will. Whether or not people know we're making their lives easier, they'll make their lives easier. So that's kind of what I think about it as, you know, making a little gift to somebody. Yep.
And these offsets are based on vehicular traffic and not pedestrian supplies.
Depends. Usually vehicular. We just had another case where me and our other staff were working on this the other day where we made it for bikes because there was such the spacing was such a way that we could do it for a slower speed and it could help make the situation safer. Most cases it's for vehicles though. But that's not necessarily always the case. You know, it does depend on if there's a lot of friction, if there's a design setup where it's a good setup for bikes or other users or anything like that, then we definitely take that type of stuff into account. If you can do both, then it's even better, right? You know, but it's not like you need to have another model of your model to simulate bike operations or whatever. But it can't hurt as a once over. We might do that if we know there's a lot of bike infrastructure there or whatever infrastructure. Buses, that type of thing. You know, a lot of trucks, a lot of semis, schools. You know, if we know there's a lot of friction or there's a curve, you know, synchro is just a model. It's just a tool, right? So just because it says that time space diagram is going to flow you right into it, if you're coming into a major curve, you're not going to take that curve at 30 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour. We're accounting for that type of stuff. Blips that might not be blips, that type of thing. Yep.
Do you have corridors with intersections? Like division, cluster,
right.
Does that progression criteria go out the window at that point?
It tends to. I should probably make sure I hope I'm recording this thing, but I'm realizing that your questions probably aren't getting taken into account on the recording. The question was being, if you have stop signs, does that get accounted into your progression? Yes and no. Usually no, right? If we had one situation where it was a T intersection that had a one-way, and I put it in there just because I already made it, and it was there, right? So while it might not necessarily operate that way, you don't need to go through and have the stop signs are a good breaking point for your model, right? The cord has to end somewhere, right? You can't make the whole world in coordination, right? So that's kind of a subjective spot. What is it? We'll use stop signs. We'll use brakes and cord. You know, if there's a cycle at 85 and another cycle at 65, you know, if those two are really close, maybe we'll combine those two, but it doesn't pay to have those offsets don't jive anyways, so it doesn't matter. Now, we'd had this exact situation where we looked at that and then thought that, okay, well, maybe we, in the AOT, just because it doesn't work during the peaks, doesn't mean that it can't jive in the AOT or an overnight plan. So you might have a model that has more than you need to, but in certain plans, it works, right? And again, maybe that's overkill, but I like to think of it as a little gift to somebody driving around. They didn't even know they'd get through, but you're welcome. You know. What's that? No, more for different cycles. And that's kind of a roundabout way that you're to your question, but most cases we don't worry about it if this is a stop. And then the TCS. We mentioned that we like to verify that before we can approve. Why is that? How come we're doing all this verification stuff? If you look at your timing sheet, that shows poles, it shows signal heads, it shows PED signals, it shows push buttons, all that stuff. We want this, even though it's a schematic, we want it to be right. Right. So the idea here is that your TSR is saying that you have your PED phase 6 is in the northwest corner, and you have two signal heads, and you have a push button, and the phase 8 PED signal is there as well. We want that to be reflected on here. We want this to be one stop. If you're putting this information on it, make it right. So that's kind of the thought there. The other catch with the TCS is that sometimes changes happen due to, you know, OUC or EFP or utility stuff, all that type of coordination that goes on, and they change stuff. We want this to get reflected of what it actually is. So TCS is kind of the final thing of design. Once that's final and set, we want this to reflect what it will be. Again, just a redundancy. If you're going to show it, make it right.
Using 14 pit.
What's up?
14 pits this year, like pit.
We'll get into that. Good question. LPIs, everybody's favorite thing. So we talked a little bit about LPIs. We talked about phase A on the cord phase. Again, just how the controller thinks. It doesn't think of it as holding the cord phase. It thinks of the cord phase is up, I'm holding the green. If that makes any sense, great. If not, we'll talk about it afterward, because it's a big, long-winded discussion that I'm sure I could talk for hours about LPIs with that and how the controller thinks. Here's how we like to model these. Because the cord phase reference 0 is actually the beginning of the LPI, we like to show that in here. So I know a lot of times, you know, you could in theory show your LPI as longer all red for the next phase. But then your reference 0 point would really be 3 seconds into your opposing all red. Just a pain to think about. Update these so that they can, you know, you can call the fake PED hold phases as your reference point because that's what the controller is thinking. Another thing with LPIs, 7 second is our usual minimum walk, unless we can give more. If there's an LPI, we like to have that 10 because 3 of that second is going to when there's no vehicles moving. Now, you can make the argument that that's better operation for pedestrians, and it is, but we want to give more time because as a visually impaired user, they might be using if there's no APS, they might be using the cues of vehicles moving to let them know that they can go, right? So we don't want to give them 3 less seconds just because we're making it safer for every other user that isn't visually impaired. So we decided, we'll just give it more time. We're giving it that anyways. That's going to be our minimum if it's LPI. That doesn't always happen. There's unique situations. We would probably rather get rid of the LPI versus having a short walk time, though. So something to think about. Another case, we talked about geometry, signal geometry, all that type of stuff. NEMA convention. We're lucky here in Illinois where we like, or in Illinois, excuse me. We are in Illinois, but in Chicago, we like to have a consistent NEMA intersection. This is probably not news to anybody, but we like to have phase 2 facing north, phase 6 facing south, and then the corresponding NEMA to match. Some places, as many know, that they'll use the main line as phase 2. We've got to standardize, so that's great. The issue is that sometimes it makes it harder for a horizontal street or a east-west type street to figure out what's what, because we still want the chord phase to be north and south as well. We don't always do that, but most cases we do. And in those cases, we want to make sure that if we decide to switch it, we're reflecting the force-off stuff to give time in the way that it needs to give time. A lot of times, the through phases, the even NEMA phases are running on PED recall anyways, so it doesn't necessarily matter if north is south or chord or east and west or south, east and west or chord. So we just like to keep it to north and south unless there's a reason we shouldn't. Sometimes those reasons are precedent. They did it for a reason. We want it that way. Sometimes those reasons are we can't get it to operate the way we want it using the force offs and tricking the controller to giving time the right way. Some of it might just be that's the way the rest of the corridor is. So that is a very fluffy one for you, but that's kind of the thought behind that. And we had talked about this. Signal heads and poles are in correct locations. I told you this was going to be in here. This is one that we're working on it right now. This is at East River Road in Bryn Mawr. The TSR locations are consistent with the schematic of the timing sheet. So we have reviewed the TCS here, and those are in the same spots as well. Just another one of our redundancy points. We are 15 minutes. I think we got a little bit of time because we're almost done with these, but we're getting into the nitty gritty of this timing sheet here, because this is the other big chunk of what goes on here is the dial tables, split tables, essentially. In an interval controller, you can decide that you want different yellows, you want different extension times, you want different min greens, you want all this different type of stuff, depending on plan. With NEMA, we can do that, but we like to do it where they're consistent. They're global settings. You put that in once, and the whole system, regardless of plan, will use that clearance interval. Now, I say that we like to do that regardless of plan, unless they're not. There might be a situation where, for some reason, we decided, you know what, there's a school running during this plan. We want to have a different extension. We want to have a different min green. We like to avoid that type of stuff because it's more things for DEO to code into the controller. We want to say if they're very busy, we want to make sure that we're giving them the easiest and the most efficient thing that they can type in without unnecessary like doohickeys and stuff like that, right? They're more than capable. They can make it work whatever we need it to, but if we don't need to, why are we doing it, right? So we're trying to keep those consistent across. Also, min greens and vehicle extensions, this is actuation 101. Those are only needed if you're not on recall. We can talk more about that if people have questions on it, but that's kind of the thought, is that you need those if they're not on recall. If they're not on if they're on recall, you don't need them. So if you look at your timing sheet here, you can see phases 2 and 4 and 8 and 6 don't have min greens or vehicle extensions because they don't need it. It's on recall. So that's that point. Yellow times based off the speed in most cases. Usually we're using a 3-second yellow. If it's more than 35 miles per hour, we use 4. That can even change if there's other cases, because on Lakeshore, we use 4 for every approach, regardless of the speed, being the idea that we know that Lakeshore is such a high speed roadway. We want to avoid any situation that might cause an unsafe setup, right? So even if you're at Science in Lakeshore, you're leaving your 7th grade field trip on a bus, you want a little bit extra time if you need it, whether or not you do need it, because maybe there's a backup going on, or maybe there's somebody zipping down and not following the speed limit or whatever. So just a redundancy. We don't always do that, and it's almost only Lakeshore unless we think of a different location. Internally, we haven't been able to think of another location, right? We thought of Cicero, Pulaski, some of those other big high-speed ones, but even then, nothing drives like Lakeshore, right? And that's just kind of the thought there. The other part, the boring part, but one of the most important parts, the math, right? All this stuff is math. Some of it is actually, getting a decided factor, but some of these things are just things that we care about internally, and we want to make sure that they're getting reflected. So obviously, your splits, you want those to be right. You're making a timing sheet, not rocket science. You want your sheet to be what your synchro says. Those splits, those are in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11th, I believe, column. So those are right from synchro. A max green and a walk time, those numbers are calculated. We are working on a automatic NEMA table. If you have one, send it to us. We'll check it out, right? There's no reason we need to be hand typing some of the stuff in. We can make our lives easier, but we're working on that on our end and how we can, get that as optimal as possible. Because really your max green is just an equation that we care about internally, right? It's not it's a value, but it's not really something that is entered into a controller or decided. It's just math, right? Your LPI, your split minus your LPI minus your yellow minus red. That's how long your signal is green for. And then the walk is just that same number, subtracting the flash and don't walk and putting the LPI back on there. So we talked about the 3 feet per second MUTCD check. If we ran low on that, we would modify the split to reflect the correct needed walk time. So you're doing a reverse constraint meeting situation. Obviously checking to make sure that your cycles are adding up, and even better, I don't have this on here, but checking to make sure that your ring and barriers are adding up, right? Your cycles might be able to add up, but if your ring and barrier doesn't, then it's right, but it isn't really right, so that's something to be thinking about. Flash and no walk, the minimum of 10, that is the thought that if we have a chord, especially in a chord phase, if we have time, let's make that flash and no walk a minimum of 10, just because it's a better system. It just makes it a little more user-friendly. We're not referring to the walk time. The confusing thing here is we're talking about 2 situations where we are talking about a walk time of 10 in the case of an LPI, and we're talking about flash and no walk of 10 in the case of if there's room. So understand that difference, because that is a hiccup that can happen sometimes when people look at these. We talked about the MUTCD extra check, non-lock, recall, force off. The bottom 3, make sure those are all correct. You had a question about non-lock. That is essentially referring to, if you have a protected signal, you want it to lock, because they will not be able to go. If it's protected permissive, you don't want it to lock. Usually we assume that the even phases are locking. This is strictly a vehicle point. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it might. You had a question about ped lock earlier.
No, it was the holding head.
Oh, okay.
And also the other thing I have in mind, you mentioned yellow. Is the all red always 2, or
all red is dependent on stop, the stop bar to stop bar. That can be 1. It reads 1, 2, 3. I don't think we have a 4, but I think the cutoff is like 160 or something. Don't quote me on that number, but that's what we use.
So you guys around this to the nearest this like 0.5.
Just second. We don't use 0.5s in any of our numbers. Yep. Yep. Good question, because a lot of agencies do, right? You want to get as much efficiency. Yeah, right. Totally. We've made our math easy for ourselves, so we don't do that. Force mode. Does everybody understand force mode stuff? Because I've got a neat little trick if you don't. What the force mode does is it tells you where extra time is going. If you have an actuated signal and you don't have a left turn come up, it's got to give that time somewhere, right? So we have NA, which is just non, because it's a pre-timed signal. It doesn't have actuations. We have fix and we have float. Fix will always give time to the next phase. Float will always give time to the chord phase. Next has an X, so does fixed. Float has an O, so does chord. That's how kind of one of the ways you can remember which one of those things goes on. So because we alter the force mode, we can change. That's how we kind of get around that north-south chord issue, right? So looking at this signal here, this is the Hyde Park and 57th. You'd normally think 57th would be chord phase, right? We're making phase 6 the chord phase. Really, the way we're doing it is that it's going to the next one. Well, in this situation, it's a little different because these are on max recall, but it's giving the rest of the time where it sees fit and saves that. So just something to think about with that. If there's any questions, we can talk about that. We got 6 minutes. I want to make sure we at least get to the end of it, and then we can have more questions as we go through. Lag loss, self-explanatory. If you wanted to know which is leading or lagging, we don't like to do 5-section lagging because of the trap, but we are allowed to do it by maneuvering it in such a way that we bring only those phases up and we have an all red associated for that. Again, we don't like to, but we've made the controller work in such a way that we can make it happen safely if we need to. Offsets. Offsets. This is your offsets. The one thing is that I almost don't want to tell you all about this, but you're going to see it in the table, and I want you to understand what that is getting at. We talk about LPI phase being reference point 0. Sometimes you'll get a plan where that wasn't the way they did it. And regardless of the way that they did it, that's not what the controller is doing, right? So what you can do is if that LPI phase is not A on the chord phase, you can modify your offset by the LPI amount, and that's actually what it'll be. So assuming they want the LPI to be, or they want their offset to be exactly what it is, it's not really what it is, but you can make it what they want it. Does that make sense? Most of the times you're not gonna have to worry about it because you're making the sheet anyways. You all know because you've checked this QA document that LPI phase should be A. So again, I almost didn't want to tell you just because I don't want to even think about it. So you're good with that. And then one more, and then we'll get in there. Just the last point, flash operations. We flash all red. In the past, we had done mainline yellow and cross street red. Nowadays, we just do all red, and we specify what things are flashing. If it's protected arrows, we might, depending on what's happening, flash different movements. I think when there's a flag phase, we need to flash it, things like that. So overlaps, a lot of overlap stuff has to get denoted in that. And that is it. Go for it.
Offset question.
Sure.
In synchro, what do you guys prefer? Like to see like beginning of green, beginning of yellow, Fiesta first green?
Beginning of green.
Beginning of green.
Yep. Beginning of green for your offset reference 0 points. Yeah. Yep. Anything else? Yep.
Can I just ask a question about the offsets in general? Since you guys don't have like systems and no master intersections, what is that actually referencing as a 0 point?
Absolute 0 is what these use. And if you know what that is, he's laughing because it's what the controllers use. We're building out our system. We're connecting our system. We're using cell modems in MyVision and other tools to make sure that things are actually where they say they are and there's not drift occurring. But that is what they are calling. We'll talk more about that offline if we need to. Yep.
For the timing schedules, for the phasing diagram, If they don't drive, do we ever list like a phase or anything like that? Or I know I felt like I had here where like phase B, we put phase 2 as well, and then instead of just phase 6.
Yeah. So that's a good point. That's usually we would. In this situation, we did not for some reason, just because there's the PED phase for 2 is there, but you are right. That could be a 2. Yep. Honestly, this phasing is more of an informative thing. If there's a vehicle phase there, we definitely would. I thought this was a good representation, but maybe we have one little error on that one. But that's on me. We signed this. This is already getting built. This is a lot of the stuff here. I should clarify too, is not. It's redundant, right? A lot of it is just for us to have. So the big reason we have, max green walk times is that if I go in the field, I can see, or if we have somebody that's just starting off, they want to know, oh, it should be green for this amount of time. There should be a tech that sees that and say, oh, well, I don't need to know what's going on with all this stuff, but I know that it's not running the max green that it says it should. Or if we get, we talked a little bit about how we have a very litigious constituency. If we get called into court, we know exactly it should be doing this amount, right? So it's kind of just an internal reason for doing a lot of it. So a similar note, the phasing stuff is more just for information. So a lot of this stuff is kind of just to help ourselves internally know what's going on with it. Good catch. Anything else? Yeah.
Traditional phase 2 design process with a 60-90 final plan submittal. What's your recommendation on the timing of TSR?
Good question.
TCS, and then the timing schedule.
So I'm going to leave that open to the group. I think it's 60, 90. It's weird because you want to have, ideally 60 so you can change things if needed. Or but you also don't want to have it. It's a in-depth process, so we don't want to tie the project up either if it's in 90, right? So it's essentially at the spot where you're thinking things are comfortable and they will have low amounts of change. We're figuring that internally what we should be telling, working with streetscapes and other groups of, on a project standpoint, when does you as a consultant need to be thinking about that. But I don't have a great answer for you on that.
No hard and fast rules.
We give the QA, but we didn't say this is a QA standard. We didn't say these are rules. Anything can, unless it's not MUTCD compliant, anything can flex, anything is case by case, similar. And I think that's why some of these things have taken so long to have a document like this, or to have people understand what's going on, because we'll change things, or we might not have it necessarily fleshed out in a true standard document. So things can change, and that's the answer, is I guess the spot.
For going back to the signal head placement, 2 signal heads and cone vision, that kind of thing. But do you have any guidance on when you want supplemental, far left, near right? Any of that kind of stuff? Yeah, it's in here, but a lot of it comes down to, again, case by case. We like to have the 2 primaries. We like to have one on the far left pole, if needed. Sometimes we don't. If there's a certain distance, we like to have a near side. I think the MUTCD calls for, I don't know the number off the top of my head, 180 maybe. Or if it's above a certain distance, install one. In this situation, actually not for this situation, this project, there was one location where we had a really far back stop bar. We put it in there because we want people to know this is where they stop. Or again, that's, some of that is case by case. And one of the things that you had also mentioned, the cone, if it's a big turn, if there's a big long angled corner that people are taking, we'll have multiple throughout that curve to inform people, so that they don't drive through and halfway through they're like, oh, well, I mean, not that you're going to stop in the middle of the intersection, but
the idea that they still know how much time they would have, or that it's yellow or whatever. So again, case by case.
If these documents are kind of live documents, is there a place that we can reference them easily?
Yeah, somewhere. We got to figure out what that looks like. I think the current thought is that we will have a running email list, and then my current thought is that every quarter we'll send out any updates that come with them. The reason I don't like that is because I have to manage that list, right? So, and it's a lot of people, right? We have a lot of consultants, a lot of people like to work with us. So it's one of those where like we want to make sure that we're giving the best product for people that need it, but also, if we were to put this online, can we get it online in time? Can we get it in such a way that it gets updated consistently? That's probably the ideal, but there's internally ways that we're trying to figure out whether that's the right way or not. So another probably reason why you haven't seen any of them, right? We've been dispersing them here and there and testing them on our consultants, and we had just added some stuff to this yesterday. Our one thought was, once we don't add things to this document for 3 months, then we'll send it. But we never got there, right? So let's, what point is it good for people to have and to understand what's going on versus having to keep changing it, And then the other thought is that, this is online. We don't want somebody to take this and say, well, you said this. Well, I said that, but this is all case by case, right? So while we're saying this is drafting guidelines, it's still, we want to be careful for stuff like that. So we're figuring that out. Yep. Any other questions? We can stick around here as long as you all want. It's 4:35. I'm on the clock till 5, so we can. If you guys got it, if you want, before we dug in, we kind of had answered questions throughout, which is good. But if there's, if we had more time, honestly, like a half day, we would have gone through and done one of these and looked at what each thing is looking at. But if there's anything that you're looking at on this list that's like, well, I know it says that, but I don't get what it means, you're probably not alone. So let us know. And
It's safe to say if we have a pole or a post that's up against a curb in a greenway, that an extension is not required, or should we still make the call out?
If you're sure that no extension is required, and you've done the math that no extension is required.
I guess the center of the foundation, and then the distance of the curb, that offset, that should be less than 8 inches.
Yeah, if you're sure, if it's right on the, I misunderstood what you were saying. If it's right on the edge of it, you're probably fine.
I'm assuming if it's right off, then it's probably you're
right.
More safe to add the extension.
The point is that we've had this happen a few spots where in the field at the turn on, they haven't been able to turn on because the plans have been different. This wasn't what they designed. At some point, people on the street don't care what was designed, and that's why we have so much work to make sure that the TCS, we have so many moving parts. We're kind of the ones that funnel it all, right? So how do we minimize the amount of those type of things happening? We started putting the extension notes in here so that they also get hopefully reflected in the TCS plan, so that when people are buying all the things needed, they don't get surprised by an extension that they need for a foot, So.
Because 8 inches is very minimal, especially on shoes.
Right. Any other questions?
I'll do one more.
Sure.
On the TSRs, I see detection zones, but not a detector. You want to see detectors?
I would love to talk about that. So we're moving into the future using my vision. We no longer use loops. So there was a thought where we'd like to put the fisheye lens is what they use. I'm sure we've all heard about my vision. If we haven't, it's a fisheye lens that is essentially able to look at the full intersection and count as well as actuate for the intersection, serving as a detector. We had played with the idea of putting that in the TSR. There are people that we have told to put in the TSR that have put it in the TSR that we've approved and are okay with. At this point, we are not putting that information in there because similar note of the making the signal heads and everything be consistent with the TSR. If we want it there, we want it to be right. And we don't want there to be any reason why down the line when they need to change the location of that it causes a hindrance to doing that. Does that make sense? The TSR said this needs to be on this southwest corner pole. So I'm not, when in the field we find out that, okay, whatever, we can't do that. If we have any friction down in the field of saying, well, we need to follow the plans. Yeah, but if it doesn't work, we don't want to say it if it doesn't work, right? So we want to be redundant, but we also don't want to be too redundant that we're causing issues later down the line.
So that would only go on the TCS plan?
Yep, that's on the TCS, correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And
So it is mentioned, it's
Will
covered.
be mentioned eventually. And
Yep.
could you even add like a caveat saying like, if it doesn't work in the field in this corner, like, just.
Right. Our thought is that we're not even about, we said it at one point, we did some thinking on it, and we're not even asking for it on the TSR anymore. So if you want it, great. We'll probably exit out, or we'll probably keep it and just, if it was in there, we'll put a caveat. But honestly, it's not related. It's related to the operation of the intersection, but it's more in line with conduit land than traffic signal design land.
Does that need to be shown on the timing schedule?
No.
Because I know for temporary timing schedules, usually if you want to, you have to put a camera if you want to.
Right.
Actually, the left turn.
Right. We didn't get into temporary timing stuff and temporary TSRs. There's a reason for that. We're trying to figure out the final version of that yet. But at least we can show the actuation zone, right? So we are showing that there's actuations occurring. We don't necessarily need to say where the actuation detector is going. Good question.
And I know this isn't related, but for the TCS, I received a comment that it has a 360 fisheye camera, but you actually don't need to show the detection zone. That was one of the comments we received.
On a TCS?
Yeah. So. Just confirming, just.
No, I get it. I don't know what goes fully into those.
Okay.
Good point, though.
I don't know if you guys, I know
No.
you said it wasn't your department, but. it was-
No. We review it. We don't approve it.
Okay.
I don't need more to do. We got people that are better at it than me to do that.
Fair
So
enough.
no, good point though. Good question. Yep. Yep.
Last one.
Go for it. Oh, we got time. We can have more questions if you guys want.
Just a quick one.
Yep.
Temporary traffic signal installation.
Yes.
You need a dedicated temporary TSR
Yes.
for temporary.
So one of the things that we have in this electronic document is a temp TSR QA/QC document. The reason we didn't show it for also lack of time, but because that's also getting finalized. But anytime you're doing temporary control and the lanes are shifting, the signal heads are shifting, anything is differing from the normal operations, yes, we need a temporary TSR. Span wires, dimensions of where those things are going. It doesn't need to be as in-depth as, showing utilities and stuff like that. But we want it to be to scale, and we want it to show this is where we want this thing to be. We haven't always done that. We're starting to do it now, just because during construction, so much can happen. We want to make sure that we are approving what's happening and that things are going the way they should be going. At least we said that they should do that. Whether it gets built like that, that's up to them. Maybe that's the reason for not doing it, but we told them to do this. Do it. You know what I mean? So, but great point. With that, we have the signal heads, lane locations. We have what's getting closed, pedestrian movements. If you're having push buttons, those type of things. So it's kind of a diet. People have called it a mini TSR, but I want to not think of it as a mini TSR. I want to think of it as a temporary TSR. And usually that is, you can just put that on top of the document you're working with, and span wires and dimensions and stuff like that. Great question. Anything else? Cool. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to stop recording.